very much, everyone. My name's Jon Davis, and I'm head of the history department here, and I'm chairing what I think is a session that will mesh very well with the ones that have already taken place earlier this afternoon. We've got 4 experts with a range of interests in the area of manufacturing and services, and in particular in the area of outsourcing. And I think the crossover of their interests in policy, law, regulation and procurement is likely to lead to a lively development. I would say we're clearly going to build on some of the issues from earlier this afternoon. I think I see myself very much as a ringmaster. As a medieval historian, my expertise in contemporary outsourcing is fairly limited, although I do know quite a lot about the ways in which medieval kings, for example, outsourced the defense of the remoter parts of their kingdoms. And it was something that didn't always work, and I think there may be some resonances in that. Anyway, without more ado, I shall introduce our speakers. Jon Davis from the Mile End Group, Contemporary British History. Nicolas Fox, patent attorney. I'm not going to spend time on lengthy introductions because you have a good biographies of everybody in your actual handbook. Professor Ian Walden, Professor of Communications Law, and Tim Cowen. And I think Tim is going to kick off and in fact pick up some of the ideas that came through in that final question in the previous session on issues of globalization. Tim.
Thank you very much indeed. It just struck me that there's been a sort of series of trends, both in globalization and contracting, that perhaps are worth sticking on the table as a matter for debate. I became the chairman of an organization which didn't exist 10 years ago. It now has 10,000 members. I became its chairman about 4 years ago. It's called the International Association of Commercial and Contract Management. The reason it didn't exist, I think, is because there was no particular need for it. What it deals with now is large, complex international contracts and the misery and woes of the poor people who have to deal with them, which is really a last 10-year phenomenon. And we were thinking about this at a conference in Orlando a couple of years ago and saying, well, why is it that this hasn't developed before? And if you go back maybe 100 years, if I can tie it back to medieval history, believe me, that is a challenge for today. But if you go back maybe 100 years and think about world trade, the proportion of trade as a percentage was probably, up until about 2006, a greater percentage than today. But it was sale of goods type agreements. And there was a lot of primary growth of primary products, and processing and manufacturing took place in different parts of the world. What we've seen dramatically, maybe in the last 20 years, is a much greater degree of interdependence between the services economy, which we've seen generating and developing here in, I'd say, London, but the West more generally, notoriously in financial services, but in many other areas as well. And also that interdependence with perhaps lower level manufacturing, but I think it's very much a perhaps, because certainly the job that I had for 8 years was developing BT's global business. And that really involved outsourcing to places like Bangalore and Delhi, and use of very high quality people who were providing, I think, world-class computerization services, world-class, it's not really manufacturing, but IT, bespoke IT services, on a very interdependent basis. So I guess there's 2 trends. One is globalization. The second trend is a change in the nature and the development of contracts, so that they're far more interdependent. They become much more complicated beasts. Now, obviously, that raises a number of issues. You know, how you deal with the issues that basically where the legal systems were set up in the Victorian age and are really hopelessly inadequate for dealing both with fast-moving markets and the current relationships that depend on the contracts that underpin them. Anyway, those are just thoughts that came out of the last session.
Right, thank you very much. Ian, do you want to build on that?
Yes, I mean, my particular interest at the moment is this phenomenon known as cloud computing. And cloud computing is about essentially moving your information, your processes, from your computer, which we've grown so fond and used to the network. The network most obviously manifest in the internet that we utilize and depend on. But we're actually seeing a more fundamental outsourcing where people like my teenage sons, for example, they have very little data at home. All of their music, all of their friends, conversations, letters, the writing we were talking about in the previous session occurs on the net and is resident on the net and maybe exposed on the net to others. And so for me as a lawyer, the challenge of that is clearly where our lives are being written and communication is occurring on the net. The security and the vulnerabilities of that for us as individuals and for us as a society, because to the extent that we have shifted our fundamental, the data upon which we depend into the cloud, then it's not clear what laws are subject to it, to what extent it is complying with regulatory obligations, and is clearly vulnerable to those that wish to cause harm to us. So my interest is globalization as manifest in the cloud.
Right, thank you. Nicolas.
Again, we seem to be talking more on the offshoring side rather than the outsourcing side. But looking at offshoring from a patent attorney's perspective does raise a number of issues. As was brought up to begin with, the legal systems we have a definite Victorian feel to them. One of the early globalization attempts is the Paris Convention, the basis for claiming priority. And that doesn't work as well when data can be moved and services can be provided worldwide. Another of the hats I wear, I'm a member of IPREG, the IP Regulatory Board, which regulates patent and trademark attorneys. But it only regulates patent and trademark attorneys in the UK. And how does that fit in this globalized world? One of the big fundamental issues with outsourcing and indeed offshoring, it doesn't really matter, is how you maintain control, how you can ensure that you get quality. As a regulator, IPREG imposed certain quality controls on patent and trademark attorneys to make sure that the public gets what they want to pay for. But it does raise an issue then, if that is then used as a front to move something offshore or outsourced to other people who are not regulated. Throughout the whole outsourcing construct, there are these problems which have to be addressed. And it is one where legal systems need to develop so that you can control things properly.
Lovely, thank you. Jon.
Well, my angle's slightly different. Sorry about the voice, I sound like